Hey, old man, what war did you lose? Vietnam? Korea? You look ancient enough for both. The laughter that followed cut through the peaceful autumn afternoon in Riverside Park like shrapnel. Marine Lance Corporal Jack Smith looked up from his bench, his jaw tightening as he watched three teenagers circling an elderly man near the walking path. The old man stood there silently, his shoulders slightly hunched, wearing a faded jacket that had seen better decades, saying nothing as the kids continued their mockery. Jack's hands curled into fists. If you believe disrespecting our veterans is never acceptable regardless of age or circumstance, comment, respect. Right now. Jack had been enjoying a rare afternoon off from Camp Pendleton, sitting in the park with a book he wasn't really reading, trying to quiet the noise in his head from the training exercises that never seemed to stop. He was 23 years old, 3 years into his service, and already feeling the weight of what it meant to wear the uniform. The park had become his sanctuary, a place where he could remember what civilian life felt like, what normalcy tasted like before the Coros had reshaped him into something harder and sharper. But watching those teenagers, they couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, circle that old man like hyenas around wounded prey, Jack felt something ignite in his chest that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with basic human decency. The old man was thin, probably in his 80s, with white hair that looked like it had been cut with kitchen scissors. His clothes hung loose on his frame, pants held up with a belt cinched too tight, shoes that were clean but worn through at the toes. He carried a small paper bag that probably contained bread for the ducks at the pond. Everything about him screamed invisible, forgettable, easy target. The kids had probably been bored, looking for entertainment, and found the easiest victim they could find. Someone who wouldn't fight back, someone who couldn't. "What's in the bag, Grandpa? Your dentures." The tallest kid, wearing a backwards baseball cap and expensive sneakers that probably cost more than that old man's entire outfit, reached out and grabbed the paper bag. "Leave me be," the old man said quietly, his voice rough like gravel but steady. There was something in that voice, something underneath the age and the weariness that made Jack's instincts prickle. "Please, just let me feed the ducks." Jack was already moving before he consciously decided to. His book hit the bench and he was crossing the grass with long, purposeful strides, his body language shifting into something that made nearby joggers instinctively give him space. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying the kind of command that came from leading fire teams through simulated combat scenarios. "You three, back off, now." The teenagers turned, their expressions shifting from cruel amusement to defensive bravado. The tall one with the cap looked Jack up and down, taking in the high and tight haircut, the USMC t-shirt, the bearing that screamed military even in civilian clothes. "What's your problem, man? We're just talking to the old dude." "Your conversation's over," Jack said, stopping a few feet away. He kept his voice level but let them hear the steel underneath. "Give him his bag and move along." The second kid, shorter with a patchy attempt at a beard, scoffed. "Or what? You gonna fight some kids in the park? That'll look real good for you, Marine boy." Jack didn't rise to the bait. He'd dealt with worse provocations during deployment workups. "I'm not going to do anything," he said evenly. "But you're going to give this man his property, apologize, and leave, because that's what decent human beings do." The third teenager, a girl with dyed purple hair and enough attitude to fuel a small rebellion, rolled her eyes. "Jesus, it's just some random old homeless guy. Why do you even care?" "Because he deserves respect," Jack said, his voice dropping lower. "Because age doesn't diminish the dignity owed to another human being. And because—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes catching on something. The old man had shifted slightly, and Jack could now see the inside of his worn jacket collar. There, barely visible, was a pin. Small, tarnished with age, but unmistakable. The eagle, globe, and anchor. The Marine Corps emblem. Jack's entire body went rigid. His eyes snapped to the old man's face with new intensity. really looking at him now, past the wrinkles and the age spots and the weathered skin. Looking at the way he stood despite his apparent frailty, feet shoulder-width apart, balanced, centered. The way his hands, gnarled with arthritis, still hung at his sides in a position that suggested decades of muscle memory. The way his eyes, faded blue and tired, were watching Jack with sudden sharp awareness. "Sir," Jack breathed, and the word came out like a prayer. "Are you a Marine?" The old man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight straightening of the spine, a fractional lift of the chin. "Once a Marine," he said quietly, and there was something in those 3 words that made Jack's throat tighten. The teenagers sensed the change in atmosphere, but didn't understand it. "So what?" the tall one said, still holding the paper bag. "Doesn't mean—" "What's your name, sir?" Jack interrupted, ignoring the kids entirely now. His heart was hammering against his ribs. The old man hesitated, then squared his shoulders in a way that suddenly made him look less frail and more like exactly what he was. "Thomas Garrett," he said. "Gunnery sergeant, retired." The world tilted. Jack actually took a step back, his hand coming up to his chest as if he'd been physically struck. "Thomas Garrett," he repeated, his voice cracking. "Tommy Gun Garrett?" The old man's eyes widened slightly. "Haven't heard that name in a long time, son." Jack turned to the teenagers, and whatever they saw in his face made them collectively take a step back. "Do you 3 have any idea at all, who you've been mocking?" His voice was shaking now, not with anger, but with something bigger, something that felt like standing before a monument you thought had been torn down decades ago. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Garrett, on November 4th, 1968, in Quang Nam Province, Vietnam. His platoon was ambushed by a North Vietnamese regiment. 40 Marines pinned down by over 200 enemy fighters." The park had gone quiet around them. Other people were stopping now, drawn by the intensity of the moment. Jack was breathing hard, the history pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. He'd studied this in boot camp, in leadership courses, in late-night sessions when the drill instructors wanted them to understand what it meant to be a Marine. Gunny Garrett was wounded in the first minutes of the ambush. Shrapnel in his leg and shoulder. He was bleeding badly, probably going into shock. Any reasonable person would have called for evacuation, but he didn't. Jack's eyes never left the teenagers' faces, watching the bravado drain out of them like water from a sieve. Instead, he took command after his lieutenant was killed. For 6 hours, he coordinated their defense while bleeding from multiple wounds. He personally manned 3 different machine gun positions when the gunners were hit. When they ran low on ammunition, he crawled through enemy fire to retrieve magazines from fallen Marines. He called in artillery strikes so close to their position that he was knocked unconscious by the concussion. And when the enemy finally retreated and reinforcements arrived, 37 Marines were still alive who wouldn't have been if not for him. The girl with purple hair had gone pale. The shorter kid had dropped his defensive stance entirely. The tall one with the cap was staring at Thomas Garrett like he'd just materialized from thin air. "He received the Navy Cross," Jack continued, his voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "The second highest military decoration for valor. His citation reads like something out of a movie, except it was real. He was real. He bled for Marines he'd known for weeks and Marines he'd just met. He nearly died so they could live. And you," his voice hardened again, "you were mocking him for being old, for having the audacity to survive long enough to age." The paper bag slipped from the tall teenager's hands. He bent down mechanically, picked it up, and held it out to Thomas Garrett with shaking hands. I'm sorry, sir," he whispered. "We didn't know. We're sorry." His friends echoed him, their voices small and ashamed. Thomas took the bag with a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "You should leave now," Jack said quietly. "And you should remember this moment. Remember that every person you meet has a story you know nothing about. that the homeless-looking old man feeding ducks might be the reason dozens of people got to go home to their families. That respect isn't earned by youth or wealth or appearance. It's owed to every human being until they prove otherwise, and even then, grace matters. The teenagers fled, not running exactly, but moving fast, their heads down, their earlier swagger completely evaporated. Jack watched them go, then turned back to Thomas Garrett, suddenly aware that his eyes were burning with unshed tears. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I should have intervened sooner. You intervened exactly when you needed to," Thomas said, and for the first time, there was warmth in his voice. "And you knew. How did you know?" Jack wiped at his eyes roughly. "Every Marine knows your story, sir. Or they should. You're in our history. You're part of what we're taught about leadership under fire, about sacrifice, about never leaving a Marine behind. You're a legend." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the pond where ducks were gliding across the still water. "Legends aren't supposed to get old," he said finally. "Aren't supposed to struggle to carry groceries or need help opening jars or get mocked by children in parks. Legends are supposed to stay frozen at their moment of glory, young and strong and capable, not turn into this." He gestured at himself, a small, bitter movement. Jack stepped closer. "With respect, sir, you're still Thomas Garrett. The years don't change that. What you did doesn't diminish because time passed, and you're still standing. That's its own kind of courage." Thomas looked at him, really looked at him, and something in his weathered face softened. "What's your name, son?" "Lance Corporal Jack Smith, sir, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." "You're a good Marine, Smith," Thomas said quietly. "The kind that makes an old man remember why it mattered." They stood together in silence for a moment. Two Marines separated by 5 decades and infinite experiences, connected by something deeper than either could fully articulate. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking," Jack said hesitantly, "what are you doing here alone? Don't you have family or—" He trailed off, seeing the answer in Thomas's eyes before he spoke it. "Had a wife. Lost her 3 years ago. Daughter lives in Seattle with her family. They visit when they can, but life gets busy. I like the park, like the quiet, like the ducks." He managed a small smile. "They don't care about medals or stories, just the bread." Jack made a decision that would change both their lives, though he didn't know it yet. "Sir, I have this afternoon free. Would you mind if I joined you? I'd like to hear some of your stories. The real ones, not just what's in the history books." Thomas Garrett looked at the young Marine standing before him with such earnest respect in his eyes, and for the first time in years, didn't feel invisible. "I'd like that, son," he said. "I'd like that very much." That afternoon stretched into evening. They sat on a bench by the pond, and Thomas really talked, about things he hadn't discussed in decades. Not just the famous battle, but the small moments that haunted him more. The Marine who'd shared his last cigarette. The kid from Kansas who sang off-key to keep spirits up. The chaplain who'd prayed over the dying with steady hands while mortar rounds fell around them. Jack listened, the way young people rarely listen to the old, with his full attention and genuine interest, asking questions that showed he understood not just the tactics, but the cost. As the sun set and the park lights flickered on, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a challenge coin, worn smooth with age. It bore the insignia of his old unit. "I've carried this for 56 years, he said, pressing it into Jack's hand. "I'd like you to have it. Pass it on someday to another young Marine who understands what it means." Jack tried to protest, but Thomas's look stopped him. "You gave me something today?" the old gunny said firmly. "You gave me my dignity back when those kids were trying to take it. You reminded me that I'm still a Marine, even if I'm a broken-down old one. That's worth more than any coin." Jack closed his fist around it, feeling the weight of history and trust. "Sir, could I come back? Next week, maybe? I'd like to hear more. I'd like us to be friends." Thomas Garrett smiled then, a real smile that erased years from his face. "I'd be honored, Lance Corporal Smith. I'd be honored." And so began a friendship that would last the remaining years of Thomas Garrett's life. Every week that Jack wasn't deployed or in the field, he'd meet Thomas at the park. They'd feed the ducks, share stories, and forge a bond that transcended generations. Jack introduced Thomas to his fellow Marines, and suddenly the old gunny had dozens of young visitors who treated him like the living legend he was. Thomas started speaking at leadership courses at Camp Pendleton, his voice shaky but his presence commanding, teaching new Marines about real courage, not from textbooks but from memory and scars. When Thomas finally passed away at 92, the funeral was attended by over 300 Marines, active and retired. The commandant sent a letter. The governor issued a proclamation. But what would have made Thomas smile most was the group of young Marines, Jack among them, who stood honor guard at his casket wearing dress blues and carrying themselves with the precision and pride he'd embodied his entire life. In Thomas's will, there was a note for Jack. It read, "You saw me when I was invisible. You reminded me that my life mattered beyond one day in November 1968. Thank you for your friendship, young Marine. Thank you for showing me that respect between Marines transcends age, rank, and time. Semper Fi." Jack kept that note in his wallet for the rest of his career and long after he retired. It reminded him of a lesson learned in a park on an autumn afternoon. That heroes age. That legends need friendship too. And that sometimes the most important thing a Marine can do is simply recognize another Marine and treat them with the honor they've always deserved. Subscribe to my channel if you believe that every veteran deserves respect regardless of age or circumstance. That true courage means standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. And that the greatest bonds are sometimes formed between generations when one person simply chooses to see another's worth. Thomas Garrett lived his entire life with quiet dignity, asked for nothing, expected nothing, and received everything that mattered in his final years because one young Marine refused to let him be invisible. That's the kind of story that reminds us what service really means. Not just to your country, but to each other.